Welcome to Cardus. Welcome to this launch of one of our latest projects, the Indigenous Voices of Faith project. My name is Father Deacon Andrew Bennett. I'm the director of the Cardus Faith Communities program here at Cardus. I think many of you are familiar with Cardus, but for those of you who are not, Cardus is a non-partisan Christian public policy think tank based in Hamilton and here in Ottawa. This is very much our public sort of facing part of the organization. And we have been around for about 20 years, 21 years. And we, as I said, are a Christian think tank. We are hospitably Christian. We reach out to many other different faith communities. And really what we're focused on is looking through the lens of 2,000 years of Christian thought to understand what is the nature of our common life together as Canadians. We do this through publication, through research, through commentary, and trying to offer a faithful witness in our public square. The Cardus Faith Communities program, which I direct, is focused very much not simply on religious freedom or on freedom of conscience, but what does it mean to live a public faith? Whether that is a public Christian faith, whether that's a public Jewish faith, whatever it might be, how do we inhabit the public square fully as we are and fully as we have been created? What does it mean to offer an authentic public witness? And how do we, as people of faith, and also people who don't have a particular religious faith, how do we live with one another? How do we exist side by side and build a common life together? So this project, the Indigenous Voices of Faith project, tries to meet that goal. How do we live together with one another? I want to, first of all, thank three very important organizations who are sponsoring this evening's event. First of all, the Roman Catholic Diocese of Calgary, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and also the Archdiocese of Ottawa-Cornwall. We're very grateful for their support and also the support of the Architects Society here at Cardus and their donor members who continue to support events like this that we host. So thank you to all of them. The Indigenous Voices of Faith project, and I hope many of you have picked up a copy of the booklet that contains the 12 interviews that make up this project. A number of years ago, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who comes from a variety of sort of different Indigenous backgrounds. And he was recounting how he felt that often he wasn't very well understood. He said, you know, I'm a First Nations Canadian, but I'm also a Baptist. And sometimes I'm not supposed to be a Baptist. And there's this question of authenticity. What does it mean to be fully who I am? And that led to other conversations with other Indigenous Canadians who I came into contact with, who often said the same thing. You know, I'm a devout Christian. My family have been devout Christians for 250, 300 years, but I don't feel that my voice is being heard in the country. And so the 12 interviews that you find in the Indigenous Voices of Faith project is a small response to this secular elite narrative that seems to say that somehow if you are an Indigenous Christian or a Latter-day Saint or of another tradition, you're somehow not authentic if you live out your faith. Or if you're an Indigenous Canadian who lives out a non-Christian or let's say, Western religion, you're somehow not understood as well, or how do you fit in with those that profess another faith? There seems to be a lot of waters that we need to tread very carefully in our country. And so what we wanted to do through this project was to actually amplify the voices of Indigenous Canadians from north, south, east, and west, rural, urban, Indigenous Canadians from Iroquoian, Algonquian, Cree, Blackfoot, Coast Salish, Métis, Maliseet backgrounds, to hear what they said about their faith and how they live out their religious beliefs while fully living out also their own Indigenous traditions. And so that's what the project is about. It's our small, I think, offering on the road to reconciliation and forgiveness in our country. And so we're very grateful that all of you have joined us this evening for the launch of this booklet. And you'll hear from a number of those voices that are contained therein in these interviews. So I'd first like to, on this day, we chose this day in particular. This is one of the 3 feasts in the Catholic Church of Saint Kateri Tekakwitha, the Lily of the Mohawks. And today we mark the 343rd anniversary of her death. And really for many of us, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike, Saint Kateri is a great example of the enculturation of the gospel in Canada, not just amongst Indigenous, but also non-Indigenous Canadians. It's fitting that we're meeting here on her feast, and that her faithful witness is represented here this evening by Dr. Rosalma MacDonald, who's come from Akwesasne Mohawk territory, who I know has a strong relationship with Saint Kateri. So I'd like to sort of launch in a formal way our event this evening by inviting His Grace Archbishop Marcel d'Anfous, the Archbishop of Ottawa, Cornwall, to open us in prayer. Your Grace.
Good evening, everyone. Good to see you all gathered here for this special occasion. And Deacon Andrew has already made all the introductions about this feast day, so I don't need to say anything about it other than pray and ask for St. Kateri's intercession as we acknowledge her as protectress of Canada. So let's pray to our Heavenly Father that He may just be present to all of us today, that His Spirit may guide us as we gather to listen, to hear these voices, and to help us come together and live out His calling as being brothers and sisters. Almighty God and Father, you have given us Saint Kateri Tekakwitha as an example of how to serve and follow your Son Jesus with humility and love. Through her intercession, protect our beloved country and teach us to respect ever more fully your gifts of creation. Inspire us to build a just and virtuous society that anticipates the joys of your kingdom by safeguarding the uniqueness and dignity of all peoples and cultures. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Thank you. So this evening's event is divided into 2 panels, and roughly about 40 minutes a panel. Then we'll take a little break. You can recharge your glasses, enjoy some of our famous Cardus hospitality. But for this first panel, I've invited 3 of the interview subjects to just expand a little bit upon what they said in their interviews. And I want to begin by asking them each the same question. But before I do that, let me introduce them. So first of all, I've already mentioned Dr. Rosalma MacDonald. And Rosalma comes, as I said, from Akwesasne, Mohawk territory. She's a Mohawk consultant with 35 years of experience in program administration, specific to First Nations government planning and implementation. She has been for many years a strong advocate for First Nations and tribal rights, policy issues related to education, languages, disability, health, social development, employment training, and childcare. Her firm, Katini's Research and Management Services, focuses on Indigenous-specific consulting to First Nations and Aboriginal governments, government agencies, advocacy organizations here in Canada, in the United States, but as far afield as Russia, Australia, and New Zealand. So please welcome Dr. Rosalma MacDonald. Next to Rosalma, we have Maria Lucas. Maria is a lawyer with Goldblatt Partners in Toronto, where she is part of the Aboriginal Law Practice Group. Maria's Black Métis heritage inspired her to study Indigenous Crown relations in a historical and political context in her undergraduate degree at the University of Toronto. In her study, she discovered the unique legal framework that informs Indigenous peoples' relationship with the Crown and she came to understand that the law is key to reconciling this relationship. She went on to get her Juris Doctor at the University of Ottawa with a specialization in Aboriginal law and Indigenous legal traditions. That was in 2019. She practices law in Toronto, and she's a co-founder and secretary of the Indigenous Catholic Research Fellowship. Maria Lucas. And finally, Father Cristino Bouvet. Father Cristino is a Roman Catholic priest of the Diocese of Calgary and a born and raised Albertan of mixed Cree, Métis, and Italian heritage. He was ordained to the priesthood in 2012. He currently serves as Vicar for Vocations and Young Adults for the Diocese of Calgary and has helped to establish the St. Francis Xavier Chaplaincy for Young Adults in Calgary. He oversees that project based out of St. Mary's Cathedral while providing pastoral care for students across the city, including those on campus at the University of Calgary. Father Cristino recently served as liturgical coordinator and master of ceremonies for Pope Francis's visit to Canada in July 2022. And he also serves as a faithful spiritual director and father to many, including myself. So, Father Cristino Bouvet. So let me start with you, Rosalma. You're in the hot seat right next to me, so you get to go first. So I want you to just offer a little bit of what you said in your interview, but particularly focusing in on how you yourself have lived out both your Catholic faith and your Mohawk identity, Mohawk heritage. You describe in your interview a really sort of winding path and what that looked like from your earliest years growing up in Akwesasne, and then going off in different directions, your academic formation, and now back there in Akwesasne doing all sorts of wonderful things. So tell us a little bit about your Catholic faith, your Mohawk heritage, and how those have fit together over the years.
Oh, wow.
I know, big question.
That's a big question.
You have 2 minutes. No, I'm just kidding.
Because you know I could talk.
I know. That's right.
I think our interview took like 3 hours. So I was born and raised in Akwesasne, and I was born a cradle Catholic. My mother's uncle was the Monsignor in St. Regis for 45 years. So I grew up in a very religious environment, and that was good and that was bad. You know, because I was used to seeing nuns and priests. I wasn't used to being allowed to be a kid, you know, because of the way I was raised. And right now I'm the director for religious ed for the St. Regis Mission, and we've been teaching about confirmation and how children, when they're baptized, that's the decision of the parents. But when they're confirmed, they're adults or semi-adults or teenagers, so they have that choice. So when I had the choice, which was like 21, I left and I went to university and for like 15 years and yeah. When I do stuff, I do it big. So, but I explored Catholicism in my bachelor's degree program. They had a Newman Center. I was there. I was able to see church from another perspective because I lived on a reservation. That's all I knew was that kind of church. And so I got to meet a young priest. I got to see them play guitar, you know, and folk songs in the church. I was like, wow, this is so different. But I explored, I traveled, like as you mentioned, I've done work in Russia, Australia, New Zealand, and I've experienced other religions along the way. I even married an Ethiopian Orthodox, and that was an experience. Big experience. Because usually when I was in a room like this, I was the only face that wasn't Black, you know, so that was different. But the other thing was what I found about the Orthodox Church, the Ethiopian Orthodox, it was very, very similar doctrine to the Catholic Church. So I was kind of familiar. I felt like I'd gone back 10 years, you know, because the way the Orthodox is the way we used to be a long time ago, you know. So it was and then when I was in grade school, I used to run away from school because where the school was, there was a Catholic center, and they used to walk us over for religious ed. But I used to run to the longhouse and go over there because I wanted to learn about what was it, like to be traditional. So because in those days, I was born in the 50s and growing up in the 60s, 70s. So I'm telling my age. But there was a very, very strong split between the Catholic and the tradition. Like there was no way that it was allowed to go into the longhouse if you were Catholic. But I used to sneak there anyways. But now it's more open. Now the 80s, 90s, it became more open. A lot more of our population are traditional and Catholic. Like we had a wedding where we had, the exchange of the wedding baskets. And so we've integrated the Mohawk language, the Mohawk culture, the prayers, the hymns. Monsignor Bourget, my great uncle, he translated the prayers and the hymns into Mohawk, and so we have that that legacy. So I think there's a lot more I could
Yes.
say.
Yeah.
So my 2 minutes is up.
Okay. Just pass it to Maria.
Okay.
So Maria, tell us a little bit, so same question to you, tell us a little bit about how you integrate all these different aspects of who you are, Catholic, Black, Métis, and then the most wonderful thing I learned about Maria, among many wonderful things, but the most wonderful thing was you were baptized in the Slovak Greek Catholic Church, which is, it's just amazing. So Greek Catholics, hands up. So tell us a bit yourself and how you yourself have sort of through those different aspects of who you are, how you relate your faith and your Indigenous heritage.
Yeah, as Dolly had said, that or Rose Elma, I call her Dolly. It's a big question, and I think for me, my journey started off with not really knowing who I was culturally, actually. I was a bit of a cultural orphan. That's sort of how I describe the experience. And I'm sure that I'm not alone in that experience. I'm sure it's an experience that many of us who are mixed heritage have. So I knew that we were Black and I knew that we were Métis, but I didn't fully understand what that meant culturally. Like what are our practices? What are our traditions? So that's been sort of a journey of discovery for me as I've grown up and as I've conducted my own research and formed my own relationships. It's been a sort of a journey of self-discovery in that process. But I would say that in that journey, a lot of the content that I was discovering, it's so you understand it conceptually, and it has to move from the head to the heart too, right? Like it's sort of like you're presented with this picture of this is who your culture is, this is who your people are, and this is our story of nationhood. And I think in the Métis context, that's also varied too. It isn't just one narrative. So yeah, that journey was happening in parallel with being a cradle Catholic, born right into the church. And that I would say, like, I guess you could say the cultural practices that my family adopted came through religion. So, the feast days within the church that we celebrate, and the, Christmas and Easter, that was always a part of my lived experience growing up. But I would say as I got older, it was a question of how do we integrate this with being a Black Indigenous family. I would look to my peers who were maybe of Indian background, a Filipino background, and they have all of these very specific cultural practices that they integrate within their faith. And I would often wonder, like, well, what would that look like for us? And I've grown to discover that for Indigenous peoples more generally, the centrality of spirituality in our everyday life is not that much different from how I've come to understand the Catholic faith should be lived, which is that it should inform everything that you do. And one thing that I've taken from Indigenous peoples, and I see this even with the Indigenous communities that I serve in my practice, is their refusal to eclipse the Creator. They will not do that, and because again, it goes back to the centrality of spirituality in our everyday life. And that very much accorded with how I understood Catholicism, and I started to see those points of intersectionality as I was living one and discovering another. So yeah, it definitely wasn't. It was also a circuitous journey, but a different one from what my friend Dolly has experienced. So yeah, that's my story.
Wonderful, thank you. Father Christina, I'm gonna tweak the question slightly. I introduced you as Alberta born and raised, and your family has very, very deep ties to Alberta, especially in terms of mission. And you have a well-known, I think, ancestor who played a major role in the translation of the scriptures and decree. And so I was thinking if you maybe reflect on your own rootedness in Alberta and how you understand the whole aspect of enculturation of the gospel, and how you understand from your position as a priest, this relationship between the Indigenous people of Alberta and the gospel.
Mm-hmm. I think that one of the things I've always admired about better understanding the way in which Indigenous culture was lived was so much, especially on the prairies and out in the western part of what we now call Canada, there was a very nomadic way of life. Home was where you lived. Home was where you were. And at that time in the people's lives, you followed the buffalo and you followed the medicine. And so you moved and you moved around, but wherever you were there for that time because that place was hospitable to you at that time, according to what you needed then. And so there was a harmony around being able to move, but then being at home where you were. And so in a way, in my family, on either side of my family, I've experienced people making Alberta home because our first ancestor, the Reverend Henry Birdsteiner, my great-great-great-grandfather, who left what is now Lake Simcoe area and made his way as a Methodist missionary out to Alberta pre-Confederation, and then certainly pre-Alberta joining Confederation in 1905. That land was just what he made home because he wanted to proclaim the gospel to his own people, even if they had a different language and a different way of life than he was used to as an Ojibwe from Southern Ontario on the shores of Lake Ontario. He made that home. On the other side of my family, I have these Italian immigrant grandparents who left their homeland, left everything they knew. I think it doesn't take much imagination to consider how different a rural Italian village is from rural Alberta. And that's where they made home, because that's where they were. And that's where they raised their family. And that both of my parents would find each other in, of all places, Medicine Hat, Alberta, all those years after that making of Alberta home and creating a home for us. And that really has, I think, captured the essence of my understanding of really how we can find a way to live in common with each other, that where we are, even if the manner in which we've come there is by, Maria has said, circuitous means, and we find our way someplace in a surprising manner. Once we are there, we can find a way to build community with each other. Mm-hmm. And that is something really beautifully witnessed to, I can only speak in the Alberta context, but different cultural groups and different people, especially we see of great interest, the beautiful relationship between Métis and First Nations communities and Ukrainian immigrants into Alberta, and how that became such a tight bond because they were living in the same place, they were sharing a home. And so I think that that is, in a way, also an image of the universality of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church, wherever she has gone, hopes to find home there and to establish a place for others to call home. And that has certainly been my experience as a person of Indigenous heritage, but also a Catholic, because my Catholicism comes obviously by no surprise from my Italian side of the family. My Indigenous side of the family are from a long line of Protestants. And yet I can really say it was at the feet of my kokum, my Cree grandmother, that I really learned to study the Word of God, to take my faith very seriously and to allow that to transform me. And that there was that blending and complementarity is something I was very privileged to grow up seeing as normal. I've somehow become this icon of paradox or something across the country. People say, how is it to be Indigenous and a priest? I say, I don't know. It's like every day of the week. I just wake up and be myself. I didn't think it was this great earth-shattering thing, because growing up, as I always like to make the joke, it was normal on the culture day in school for me to bring a big bowl of pasta and a loaf of bannock. Both go well together, believe it or not. And so I thought that that was just a normal thing, because I was so blessed to come from a family that made both contributions from both sides of our culture and our religious tradition compatible. And they found a home in our home with each other. And so I realized that's not the experience of everybody, but because it was my experience, it suggests that it is possible to be others as well. And that's what I have hoped to be able to give witness to and to share about.
Wonderful. Thank you. So Rosalma, coming back to you, your interview, I think, stands out amongst the 12 as being very much just an open bearing of your heart. And I think it's valuable because you are very frank in various parts of the interview. And I think that's helpful as we try to navigate a lot of these different tensions that exist through the whole process of reconciliation. So I wanted to just read a little bit from your interview and just get you to comment a bit on it, because it builds upon what you've already said in your introductory remarks. So you said, well, like I said, I didn't want any part of this church. And to say it bluntly, it was just too white for me. I still have issues with that, because as a woman in the church, a woman could never be a deacon. I'm a lay minister, a Eucharistic minister, a sacristan, an altar server. I mean, when I came back, I shocked the heck out of my whole family. I went from one extreme to the other. Now I love the church and I can't live without it. Tell us a little bit more about that, this tension, but this close bond that you just have. You can't get away.
I did say that.
Yes. I'm glad we got it right.
Yeah. But I'm kind of looking at everybody like, oh, okay, yeah, I really did say that. Well, with the Archbishop sitting right there. So I think the problem is that I am Mohawk, because Mohawks are pretty outspoken to begin with, especially the women. And I'm no exception. So I think, I was talking about my journey. I left when I was like 20, 21, and I traveled, went to school, came back, and we had a series of Jesuit priests, a long series. Our church was established in 1752. The St. Regis Mission Church has been there for over 200 years. And we did have an Indigenous priest, Father Jacobs. He was a Mohawk priest when I was growing up. And then we had a non-Indigenous priest, but he was young and fun, and we could relate. But then after that, we had a series of priests that I had nothing in common with. They didn't understand us and we didn't understand them. I think what's different now, which is why I do say I love the church now, because we have, for one thing, we have an Indigenous priest. He's Filipino, so he's brown like us. He acts like us. He talks different, but and so that could be good and bad, you know. So, but the thing is, you know, we've integrated. Well, Saint Gadali de Gaguita, Saint Gadali de Gaguita, Gadali.
Gadali, Gadali.
I always want to correct everybody. It's Gadali de Gaguita. They've had 80 conferences, Saint Gadali conferences over the years. So there's followers of Saint Gadali all over the country. Like I was in Arizona and with some friends on the Navajo reservation, and there's a statue of Gadali de Gaguita, and I was like, wow, how do you know about her? You know? And then I said, oh, by the way, I'm Mohawk too, you know. And so there's, you know, I've developed a lot of pride and a lot of ownership in the church because of Saint Gadali de Gaguita, because she's a role model. And as I mentioned, I'm director of religious ed, so we teach our little second graders about Saint Gadali, you know, and it's something to be really proud of. And then we say our prayers. Even our little Filipino priest sings in Mohawk, you know, the Our Father. And now that's one thing, I never learned my language, so you know, I'm learning it by hearing it in the church, you know, in the Mohawk prayers, in the hymns. So you know, it's been an evolution, but it's not been easy, you know, because there's still that split in the community where, you know, the Longhouse and the Catholic. We're friendlier now and we do things together now. But when the Indian residential school stuff hit, we had 500 pairs of shoes in front of our church, and the road was painted orange in front of the church. It was a very difficult, very scary time for us. Like, you know, we were afraid for our little priest. We thought maybe somebody would come and burn down the rectory or burn down the church, or, you know, some crazy thing. But there is a mutual respect, you know, that's developed through communication and working together. So I think, but we still have a lot of healing to do. Yeah, there's a long ways to go. I don't know if I answered the question, but
I think that was great.
I end up telling lots of stories.
Well, stories are important. I think that's a lot of this project is about.
Well, I mean, I guess just to kind of finish answering the questions, we have 5 denominations in our community. We have the New Life Christian Church, we have the Assembly of God, we have the Methodist, we have the Mormon, we have the Catholic, we have the Longhouse, we have the Baptist. Actually, we have 7. Sorry. And so over the years, they didn't talk to each other. But in the last, like, I've been back to the church for about 6 years now, and there's a Akwesasne Pastors Circle. And we get together, we pray together, we talk together, we eat together, we do retreats together. That was unheard of, you know, several years ago. And then with September 30th last year, I was able to get all of them to come to our church, and we had a healing and reconciliation on the lawn of our church. Never done in 200 years, you know. So that's why I love the church now, I think, because I've been able to make changes myself. You know, I was mad because, you know, it's white. That's the way I was thinking. But now it's not, because I'm there. I'm the brown face now. I'm not really brown, but, you know, I represent the brown, and I'm at the door as the greeter, and I'm making people come back to church because they say, well, if she's there, maybe I want to be there too. You know, so that's
Wonderful. Thank you.
oh,
So you can keep that.
It appeared from nowhere.
So Maria, you just talking about this idea of mission, and, you know, talking about the mission at St. Regis. It's been there for almost 300 years now, just shy of 300 years. And, you know, the missions that dot this country, and 2 of the interview subjects, Father Deacon Gilbert Pitawanakwat and Rosella Kinoshimeg up in Manitoulin, Wikwemikong. There's another old Jesuit mission there from the 17th century. And you and I had a really interesting conversation about the concept of mission stemming back to Pentecost, and the apostles receive the Holy Spirit and they go out into the world. And we sort of, I think, had a really interesting, frank conversation again about something went wrong along the way. And so just to read from your interview, I think what we've seen in recent history in Canada is in particular a major switch in the approach to missioning. I wouldn't categorize it as evangelization or missioning. It was tied to a very violent project of assimilation and colonization. And so it can't be what Christ originally intended it to be. Again, I think it was the government and the church coming together and recognizing, well, we can use the church's institutional capacity and structure to carry out our plans for eradicating Indigenous people, either physically or through ideological colonization and assimilation. So yeah, it was an extreme departure from the early missions, and obviously from what Christ originally intended for it to be. So maybe you can just speak a little bit about how important is Pentecost in all of this. The idea that Christians, whether we read the Great Commission in Matthew's Gospel to go out there and to baptize all nations, that Christianity is not some sort of white thing. It's not European. In fact, it's originally Semitic, a little bit of Greek. So speak to that a little bit, because I think often part of the secular narrative that we have in the country is that, Christianity is a white European religion that was imposed through colonization, and then the church, unfortunately, sort of got wrapped up in this assimilationist project. When in fact, that's not borne out in reality. I mean, that there's part of that there, but that's not the story that is being told in this project, or frankly, in so many other parts of the world where Christianity does not look very European. So I'm just wondering if you want to comment a little bit about this nature of mission.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, Pentecost, that's every feast in the Catholic Church is wonderful, but Pentecost, I would say, is one of my favorite. I'm wearing red in recognition. And I think it's because of what it calls us to. It reminds us of our vocation as Christians. And, Pentecost is that time of year where we celebrate the commissioning of the apostles going out into the world and proclaiming the gospel, and doing so at a time when they were understandably extremely scared to do so, but God giving them the strength to go out and to mission to others. And I think we see, generally speaking, we see throughout the Catholic Church's presence here in Canada, particularly with early missionaries, Jesuits coming, we see that efforts being undertaken by Jesuit missionaries to understand the language, to be able to communicate in an Indigenous language, going through and recording words so that we would have a record of it, and saying prayers in an Indigenous language. I think of Saint Jean de Brebeuf's prayer, where he had translated I believe it was the Our Father into the Wendat language. So we see those early efforts to really understand the quote unquote other, right? And to bring them into relationship. And I think that corresponds, that's notion of, being brought into relationship, I think corresponds very much with an Indigenous sort of paradigm, because for us, relationships are everything.
Mm-hmm.
It very much informs our worldview. So you see sort of, I think, a space opens up to give and to receive when mission is approached in that way. But then in the later years, we see what we've heard about over the past couple of years, in terms of the violent project of assimilation, and tying mission and evangelization to that was the first mistake. So I know that for me personally, so I think that's just like the general story of mission in Canada. But I would say that for me, when I think of my own mission personally as a lawyer and as an Indigenous lawyer in particular who practices in Aboriginal law, I was always taught that for Métis people, we are a bridge between two nations because our origins as a people is that we're of two nations. We're two nations coming together. That's our origins. And this notion of being a bridge, I think of the cross because that's what Christ is for us. That's what his cross is for us. He's that bridge back to the Father. He reconciles us back to the Father. And it's extremely, it makes me really realize that reconciliation is quite a painful process. It's not easy at all. But I do see it very much as my mission that I believe that I am to carry forward, and I do so in my work as a lawyer working in Aboriginal law. But it's not that notion of mission isn't particular to a white European colonizing power. We all have it, regardless of our cultural background or where we come from. It's in all of us. It's our calling, and I think that's what Pentecost reminds us of. Like when the apostles were commissioned, they could speak different languages for the purposes of being able to communicate with many different people. So yeah, it's not a white thing. It's not a colonizer thing. It's a universal thing.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Father Cristino, on this question, again, of how Indigenous Christians in particular are perceived often, you said some very strong things in your interview, which I wanted to highlight because I think it was a very sort of courageous statement that you made. You said, I believe that Indigenous Christians in this country now are living in the time of a new martyrdom. I highly doubt it would ever be the martyrdom that costs them their physical mortal life, but they are ostracized and humiliated sometimes within their own communities if they openly express their Christian or Catholic faith. And I wanted to sort of bridge that with a second part of the question. And that is a misunderstanding often on the part of non-Indigenous people of what is genuine enculturation. And you did a wonderful podcast through Archbishop Smith's podcast where you talked about how often non-Indigenous Canadians who are devout Christians simply do not understand a lot of Indigenous culture. And you focused in particular on smudging and the role of smudging. So I'm wondering if you could speak, first of all, to what you said in your interview about the challenges that a lot of Indigenous Canadians are now facing, especially in the wake of the church burnings and so forth. Speak to that, but then also how non-Indigenous Canadians need to do a better job, especially as Christians, to understand what is genuine enculturation and what are authentic and valuable traditions that exist.
Mm-hmm. Whenever I talk about this, I like to use an image that I found the perfect synthesis of what we're referring to with regard to enculturation, particularly with the expression of our faith. It's done for the sake of making better understood on the terms of those who are receiving it, the truth that is a universal truth seeking to be conveyed. And I was working up in the Northwest Territories once, and I visited a church where the tabernacle, which in our churches and in our tradition houses the consecrated bread that has become the body and blood of Christ. And so it is seen to be the real presence of Jesus in our churches. And in most Catholic churches, there is a red candle that is somewhere near or beside that tabernacle, perpetually flickering as that symbol that Jesus is present there, that you can see that externally visible. In that church, the tabernacle was not a square gold box, it was a teepee. And there was not a red candle. There were these cutest little moccasins hanging over top of a pole that was coming out of the top of the teepee. And the priest asked me, do you know what those mean? Do you know what the moccasins mean? And I said, well, I don't know, they're cute, I guess. Maybe that's the point. He said, no, The moccasins on the pole on the outside of the teepee means that someone's home. That's how you know that someone's inside their teepee. Their moccasins are hanging on the outside. I thought that is enculturation. How better to convey a truth that a little flickering red candle just might not mean anything to someone. But in that instance, when they look at that, they can say, I relate to that. I know what that means. I told that story to Cardinal Lacroix in Quebec when we were preparing for the Holy Father's visit. And he said, find me a pair of little moccasins. I want to put those on his tabernacle and I want to tell him that story. I said, okay. And you can find anything on Etsy, believe me. Quite impressive. So we had little moccasins to put on that tabernacle. But what a beautiful way of showing what enculturation can accomplish when it's understood from that direction. Mm-hmm. It has to be, what's the truth that's seeking to be conveyed, and how do we find a way to convey it? But this dynamic of what I just sort of call non-Indigenous guilt, which is, okay, how can we make this look Indigenous? They look for an Indigenous looking thing and then impose it upon the truth that's being conveyed. It's done in reverse. And in that case, both meanings can be lost. Oh, they have this thing where smoke comes out of it. Oh, we have one of those. Okay, then we'll just take that thing and put it in at this moment of our liturgy. Well, is that conveying the same thing? If you take the smudge pot and you replace the thurible with it, does it automatically translate just because you think it looks like it does, right? A lack of understanding on one side imposes a meaning on the other side where both meanings can be lost. And so when we are trying to enculturate faith, and this is why Maria's example of the Jesuits, when they first came, I just think and pray and meditate upon their arrival a lot, because I think they must have spent a lot of time quiet and watching and listening, because they couldn't have possibly understood what they were seeing. But over time, the inner logic of the universal truths that these people also participated in by virtue of being part of the human race would have begun to emerge. And then they would have found, where are there bridges that we can build? Where are some of those intersections that can be made where we will convey, using something they already understand, a truth that they haven't heard of yet? That is honoring what these people's traditions already are. It's learning to speak in their language, whether it's a verbal language or not. And it conveys the truth that doesn't need to be modified or adjusted to accommodate the image you're deciding you want to use. And I think that that's a way in which we need to become more understanding and more creative. There was a beautiful, beautiful set of vestments prepared for Pope Francis in Edmonton for the Mass in Commonwealth Stadium. The vestments looked like normal vestments, but the beadwork and the artistry that was done on them by Julia Kozak from originally from the Niska people on the west coast of British Columbia. She integrated so much meaning in what each bead meant, what the colors meant, the way in which they were organized. And we were able to explain to the Holy Father what this meant and what this looked like. That was, as far as I was concerned, a far more impactful and significant honoring of indigenous symbology and meaning incorporated into the Catholic liturgy than doing something that might look like it was indigenous, but could have seemed out of place. It's just checking boxes that make other people feel good about themselves that doesn't necessarily equate to what's trying to be communicated in that moment. And yet that was one of the most common criticisms I received after the papal visit, was that, well, it didn't look very indigenous. So, well, what were you looking at? Things that you would have understood to be indigenous that you still don't know anything about? Or did you take the time to actually understand what was interwoven and what was integrated in, that for those who have the eyes to see would have understood and appreciated how significant this was? That's enculturation.
For example, the Squamish and Anishinaabe deacons that were serving with the Holy Father.
Right.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you, Father. Any last sort of thoughts, Maria, Rosalma, on some of these issues that we've just touched the surface of? But again, I encourage people to read the interviews. Any last thoughts before we wrap up? Maria?
Yeah, no, I was just thinking as Father Christina was speaking, I was thinking about this sort of notion of enculturation and how that looks around the world. And I've always understood enculturation as something that is when the gospel enters a space, right? It grafts, enculturation is when it grafts itself onto that culture and brings out what's most beautiful there. And it's not a culture dictating what the gospel should say. And I think that a lot of people might have a misunderstanding. If first of all, I don't know how many people have heard of enculturation, and if they have, they may not understand that that's how it actually works. That it's not a culture dictating what the gospel proclaims, but it's the gospel coming in and bringing out what's most beautiful there. And I think that just on the point of mission, as well as I was speaking earlier, I often get asked the question of, what can I do, right? And I think a lot of Canadians, non-Indigenous Canadians, who may be suffering from non-Indigenous guilt, as Father Christina pointed out, I think it's great that they have that disposition to want to do something and to want to do something great, but it's not. There's also that bit of a trepidation of not wanting to get it wrong either. And I would say that just because you're Indigenous, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have the answer and the solution, right? I think it's something that is going to come out of a lot of dialogue and exchange between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians, and that any guilt that you're carrying isn't helpful. It's not helpful in moving forward. So otherwise, that's going to keep you back from wanting to advance. So that's my final words on that.
Thank you, Rosalma.
So I guess my final thoughts is I would like to see a lot more fathers like you in the Universal Church, because I was a partner with the USCCB, and we were writing our pastoral plan. And, one of the things that we talked about was awareness, like that we still exist. Like there's, I don't know, a million Native Americans in the US, or I don't know the number, but there's a lot. And so we still exist, and there's a lot of us that are Catholics. So, why can't we have more Native American Catholics? Why can't we have, maybe another Mohawk Catholic priest? Because we did have one once. So I think that's, one of the things that I would like to see the Universal Church, integrate more of our people within the clergy. I just went to 2 chrism masses, and in Valleyfield and Ogdensburg, and there might be 60 priests and maybe 8 of color. And so like the church needs to be more multicultural, not just Mohawk, or not just Cree, or not just Navajo, but it needs to be, because from coming from Akwesasne, I have 1 foot in the US, 1 foot in Canada, 1 in Quebec, 1 in Ontario, 1 in New York.
3 bishops to work with.
Bishops, yes. I know them all well. But the thing is, I just think, we have this beacon of Saint Galilée de Gakwita. Like, she's been acknowledged by the world. And so, we tell the story often, and I thank you that you picked today, to honor her, because, she did make a difference in the 1600s. And so we have that to aspire to. I think that was one of the reasons I came back. That's one of the reasons why I decided I could love the church. And then I think people like us can make a difference, you know, like, because our stories are there and we get to talk to people like you, and we need to talk to more people like you, you know, because it's not easy. You know, I like, we were talking earlier about politics. There is politics in the church, and it's not easy, like every church. But it's even more political for us because we have, you know, all these denominations and all these things. But, you know, I think with the journey, with the time away, with the time back, now I know my place, and I'm happy, and I'm 69, and and I don't like to, well, actually I do like telling people that, because they never, they look at me, you can't be 69, you know. So, but but the reason I say that is people my age and more, you know what, they're starting to think about God. Yeah, they're starting to think about God. Who is God? When am I going to meet him? Is it going to be next week? You know, 20 years? I have an 89-year-old brother, you know, like, he talks about when he's going to meet God. And so, like, and that's it. I'll tell you one last, when I was introduced into working in our church, they asked me to do a pastoral visit because our nun was out of town. So the first person that they sent to was my neighbor, who was dying of cancer. And, you know, he was the baddest of bad boys. And, you know, and I was like, here I am coming with, you know, the Eucharist and to pray with him. And when I went in to pray with him, he asked me to get him a rosary. He thanked me, and he said to me, God is here. God is here with me right now. I never forgot that. Then I gave Father heck for sending me to the, like, why did you send me to that? But at the same time, can you manage, the baddest of the bad boys said to me, God is here right now. That's
Well,
my
thanks be to God. Please join me in thanking our panelists. So we will take a 10-minute, that's 10, 10 minutes, 10 minutes, and then please come back and we'll have our second panel. I'm very happy to introduce Melissa Mbarki, also one of the interview subjects in the Indigenous Voices project, Voices of Faith project. Melissa is a policy analyst and outreach coordinator for the Indigenous Policy Program at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute here in Ottawa, although she herself is based in Edmonton. She also comments regularly on Indigenous issues in the National Post. Prior to joining the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, Melissa spent 2 summers working as a clerk and engaging in treaty land entitlement frameworks agreements for her First Nations community in Alberta. This was her introduction to how the land system worked. She has spent much of her career in various sectors of the oil and gas industry, and her work has covered acquisition, divestment, environmental site assessments, abandonment, reclamation projects. She took what she learned in her career there and applied it to Indigenous issues happening more broadly in the country. She believes that through an understanding of ownership rights and federal provincial policies, we can determine what policies need to be changed and updated to promote reconciliation among all levels of government, but I think more generally as well. So Melissa, wonderful to have you with us. Thank you for joining us. So the Indigenous Voices of Faith project, as we found from the first panel, is very sort of strongly Christian, but we also have 2 interview subjects. Melissa, who comes from a sort of a mixed background, but she herself embraces sort of the pipe carrier tradition of Indigenous spirituality. And then we also have Professor John Burrows, who is not joining us this evening, but he is a Latter-day Saint and professor of Indigenous law at the University of Victoria and also the University of Toronto. But Melissa, I want to just start out by asking you to speak a little bit about your own background and You were raised by your grandparents, and we had quite a good conversation when we did our interview about your experience of that and two very different religious traditions that existed in your home as you were growing up. Maybe just by way of introduction, speak to that.
I grew up in a small community in Saskatchewan. The name of my First Nations community is Muskowgan. And it's not remote in the sense that you can't get there by car. It's remote in the sense that we're really isolated. And we didn't have a whole lot of outsiders coming in. And the people that I grew up with are the people that I've known for years, so since I was a child. We also have a residential school that closed in 1997. It was actually one of the last to close. So my grandmother was a residential school survivor. She went to the school from the time she was 5 to 19 years old. She went back to her family. She didn't really know her family. And so she didn't reintegrate as quickly as she said that she could have. She harbored a lot of anger towards her family. She harbored a lot of resentments because she didn't grow up with them. Whereas my grandfather, on the other hand, we also had a day school in my community as well. So he was part of the day school, but the difference between the two was he went home at night. So it was like a regular public school, and he grew up with his family. He grew up in his traditions, and actually his traditional ways are very steeped in the traditional ways. Like, he was very strong in his faith. He believed in it. It was his grandfather believed in it. His grandfather believed in it. So what I learned was through just years of that's how my grandfather grew up. So my grandmother was Catholic, and she was really strong in her faith. That was one of the things that actually kept her, that kept her grounded. It was having a belief in something and having that strong connection to the church that really helped her heal throughout the years, and it helped her raise her children. My grandfather, on the traditional side, he did a lot of sweats, a lot of ceremonies. He was, a community elder. So he went and helped families. He spoke to families. He helped them any which way he could, whether that was through visiting them, checking on them. He was really in the community, really immersed with the people. And so was my grandmother, but she was immersed in her community in a different way because she dealt with a lot of non-Indigenous people, whereas my grandfather was mainly Indigenous people in the surrounding communities as well as mine. So my upbringing was very unique in a way because not many people have the traditional ways. That way has been lost along the way. Same with our language, it's dying off. So those two things was what my grandfather tried to preserve, and it was what he tried to preserve with me and the grandkids, my brothers and sisters, my cousins. And whereas my grandmother, we supported her in what she did. She went to the church, we were all baptized. So we actually had a parallel of religions happening in my family. And what that taught me was what true reconciliation was, because they supported each other. They didn't tell each other what was right, what was wrong. They just supported one another. And that really showed up in how they dealt with the community, because there was no animosity, there was no hatred, there was no anything between them. It was just friends and community. And that's how I grew up, and that's what I knew. And I realized how lucky I was as an adult, because I had the traditional upbringing, and not many people in my community have that. Actually, very few did. And when I would talk to them about coming to our sweats or to our ceremonies, they asked me, well, what is that? And that's when I really knew what gift both my grandparents had given me, because they'd given me belief, they'd given me faith, and they'd given me the best of their world. And what they wanted me to do was to bridge those two somehow, and to really be a voice for that, and be a voice for reconciliation.
And I think it highlights so beautifully the importance of religious freedom, and that religious freedom is, certainly a fundamental freedom that we cherish in this country, but it has to be religious freedom for everybody to be able to live out their most deeply held beliefs. So maybe just expanding a little bit on that, Melissa, what is it that really you value most about your own Indigenous traditions, and how did you come to fully embrace those?
I as a child, because I was always with my grandparents, they actually raised me, and they adopted me when I was a child as their own. I wasn't their grandchild; I was one of their children, and that's not uncommon in Indigenous families for the grandparents to adopt their grandchildren. So I think because my grandfather felt like, parts of it was dying and parts of it was getting lost, he really wanted to show us as much as he possibly could and really teach us as much as he could. I didn't speak English by the time I was in grade 1. Like, I didn't know English. I knew some words, I knew some sentences, but getting to grade 1 was a challenge for me because I had to learn by a book. And with my grandfather, everything was through storytelling, and everything was through nature, and everything was through picking medicines and learning about the trees and the plants. That was my teaching, and that's what we know today as land-based teaching. So we're out in the middle of nowhere, and so as a kid, I really embraced that way of life. As a teenager, I started to question where I wanted to be. Which way did I want to go? And my grandparents didn't push me either way. They just told me it's your decision, whatever you want to do in this life, whatever religion, faith, tradition. We don't even care if you choose another one altogether. That's my choice, and that's something that's going to lead me in life, and something that's going to help me through the different stages of my life. So as a teenager, I really questioned it. And I think I really, in my early 20s, was when I decided that the traditional way was my way. And there wasn't, a big moment about it. I just knew in my heart that's where I wanted to be. And the people that were in my community, in my life, they really guided me. And that's kind of where I met my mom too, because my mom didn't believe, when I was growing up. She didn't go either way. She didn't believe in the Catholic way, and she didn't believe in the traditional way either. Like, she was kind of conflicted, and so she just chose nothing. Whereas I kind of took a different stance, where I wanted to learn everything. I wanted to read everything, and I wanted to just know it all. And my mom was complete opposite. So we actually met halfway in my early 20s, because she decided she wanted to go the traditional way as well. So we both kind of grew together in that regard, and we both had something in common, and we both really cherished what we were learning.
Maria was speaking earlier about this image of the cross being sort of this bridge, and she talked about her own Métis heritage, this bridge between two peoples. And there's sort of that echo in your experience as well, this bridge between the Catholic world and then the traditional Indigenous spirituality world. And you yourself, over the last number of months, particularly since the Kamloops sort of discovery and everything that came out of that and the church burnings, you adopted a very public sort of view on that. And I was wondering if you could speak to that. You, I think, were quite courageous in some of your writing, both for MLI, but also for the National Post, where you said, this simply cannot be the way. And, speaking from your own experience of that need to recognize that there are different expressions of faith in the Indigenous communities across the country. Could you maybe speak a little bit to that, and what inspired you to really come out very strongly to condemn what was going on, that it was fundamentally not the way to go, as I think many of us can agree. But I just found you to be so articulate in stating why this cannot be something that we can tolerate.
Coming from a traditional point of view, I was taught never to harm anyone. Don't harm anybody's belongings. Don't go to their church and don't vandalize their belongings. Don't do anything that's going to hurt anyone. So from an Indigenous perspective, looking at it from that point of view, I was conflicted for a long time. And I thought, like, why are people doing this? Why are people burning churches? That's not our way. That's not our traditional way. And you're coming from a place of anger. And even in the Indigenous way of life, we cannot do things when we're angry. They always tell us, take a break, go have coffee, go for a walk, and then come back. And let's look at this issue and let's talk about it when you're not in that state. So that really kind of angered me too, that this was happening. And when I looked at it from the Catholic side of things and my grandma's faith and what she had handed down to me, it was actually really hurtful because I don't think survivors wanted that. You know, some came from a place of anger, but when you look at my community, for example, over 40% are Christian, and our church burnt down decades ago. But if it was still standing today and somebody went and intentionally did that, it would impact my community and it would be very hurtful to the people in my community. So I really spoke out about that. I really didn't like what I was seeing because that in no way is reconciliation. That's not how you build relationships. That's not how you even honor the survivors that are alive today. Like you don't put that chaos in between and expect reconciliation to come after. It's all about working together. It's all about understanding each other, and it's all about understanding what's happening today isn't necessarily what's representative of Indigenous people, because that's really not us out there doing that, especially not my community. We don't believe in harming others, even if they're not Christian. A lot of the survivors that I know are really humble people, and they're out there trying to build relationships and friendships.
Maybe just building upon that a little bit to speak about reconciliation. What are some of the necessary ingredients for reconciliation? We hear, there's obviously been a lot of talk about truth, reconciliation, and so forth. In a number of the interviews that we have in the collection, many people are making the leap from reconciliation to forgiveness, and what is required to move from reconciliation to forgiveness. Those of us that have the experience of the Catholic sacrament of confession, of repentance, there's reconciliation, forgiveness, repentance, that's all built up into one reality in terms of making ourselves, ensuring that we're right with God and we're seeking his forgiveness and receiving that forgiveness and absolution and so forth. Maybe speak a little bit to how you see what are the necessary ingredients towards reconciliation, and then how do we make that leap to forgiveness? Because it strikes me that from what you've been saying and what you said in your interview, that this bridging is key to that. That if there's going to be forgiveness, there has to be a bridge that connects us from just reconciliation towards that next step of forgiveness.
That's a hard question. You cannot go from reconciliation to forgiveness without having some sort of healing in between. You have to heal on both sides. And what I found in my community and in working with some of the survivors and seeing my grandma as a survivor as well, she didn't get to where she was without healing. And she didn't get to where she was without making those amends. And I just go back to what my grandfather taught me when I was younger. And that was, it doesn't matter what religion or where we go, we have to have that as part of our life. We have to have some sort of spirituality. We have to believe in something. And there's no judgment on what that was or how we got there. We just had to believe in something. And that's really huge in the traditional way of life. Even if I didn't choose the traditional way of life, I would still need something in my life to make me whole and balanced as a person. And I think that's what it is just keeping balanced, having faith in something, and just really healing. Healing doesn't come easy. It actually kind of starts off the way it did with the church burnings. It starts off with a lot of anger. And once that anger subsides, then you start addressing the root issue, and you start looking at why it got that far and why people felt that was necessary. And I think that's where we are on the reconciliation side of things, is figuring out what are the root causes, and let's look at those.
Yeah, wonderful. One of the reasons behind this project, one of the sort of points, I guess, of gestation of this project was this sense that the voices of Indigenous people who maybe didn't accept this broader kind of secular elite narrative weren't being heard. And so I want to ask you, maybe it's a slightly courageous question on my part, but do you think we got some things right with this project? What's your sense of this project? Is it helpful? Is there a challenge to kind of break through a particular narrative that says somehow there's an inauthenticity between those Indigenous Canadians who are practicing a particular Christian tradition or Latter-day Saint tradition or other Christian, other religious tradition, that somehow there's not that authenticity that comes with someone such as yourself who's practicing a more traditional Indigenous spirituality. Are we on the right track here, do you think?
Yeah, I definitely do. This was one of the best, probably one of the best projects that I've ever worked on. And the reason why it was is because you brought different voices from different communities, different religions, and you brought them all into one place. And you could see a lot of overlap and a lot of similarities, but you also see a lot of differences in the way, you approach different things. And I think that's what we need. The one thing that I really liked about this is that it really put emphasis on what's not spoken about. There's a lot of Christians in my community. There are a lot of Catholics in my community. And the general public doesn't necessarily see that. And they don't necessarily see it until they see stats like 40% of us are, Catholic or Christian. So it just really highlights the diversity in my community alone, because not everybody's traditional. And actually in my community, there's probably only 3 families who are. So a lot of people in mainstream media think that we're all traditional, and we're not. And I think this really highlights that fact, because a lot of these stories, like the father had mentioned earlier, there's only 2 of us who are in this booklet, and the rest are Christian or have some sort of faith in Christianity. And I think that needs to be in the public a lot more, because a lot of voices are they're not being heard the way they should be. And that's why I was really proud to work on this project.
Well, thank you. It was such a pleasure having you as part of it. We've got a little bit of time, and I just wanted to, I had a few people come to me during the break saying they'd love to ask some questions. So maybe I can get one of my colleagues with a handheld mic to just pass that around. We'll take a few questions before we wrap things up for the evening. Just raise your hand, and my colleague Monica will find you. Just introduce yourself, please.
Thank you. Brian Butcher, Advisor for Ecumenical and Interfaith Relations for the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops. Someone has presented the difference between enculturation and syncretism, as enculturation is the syncretism you like, and syncretism is the enculturation you don't like. And I'm just interested to hear from the panelists, any who would like to speak to this. What is the threshold between authentic enculturation and inauthentic or illegitimate, depending on how you conceive it, syncretism, and why we give sort of a positive a view of the former, and we have a pejorative sense of the latter?
And that this is open certainly to all of our panelists. So maybe we'll take a couple of questions. Yes, sir.
Thank you. This is me, Francis Yell. Just want to have a question to you. This is, I think, is my third attending these events, and want to know what is a relationship between a Catholic Church of Canada and the government, liberal government, how they deal, because I see things are turning the way the Catholic practiced, and the liberal governments doing their own things. Thank you.
Thank you. Just behind you there.
Hello, my name is Ralica Chulakova, and I'm a Orthodox Christian. And my question was actually more for the panelists before that. I was just curious to know if there are any Indigenous people that are Orthodox.
Christos Voskres.
It was mentioned that there is a huge Ukrainian community in Alberta, and most of the Ukrainians are Orthodox, and if that's somehow intertwined with Indigenous culture.
Okay, maybe we'll start with the first question about sort of syncretism, sort of a maybe Brian, sort of a somewhat intermixing, not very consistent intermixing of traditions, as opposed to an honest kind of coming together of different traditions, perhaps. So, any thoughts on that, Melissa? Any thoughts on sort of how traditions mix? What is authentic? What is maybe inauthentic?
I can only speak for myself and what I know and my religion, which is our traditions, which is very different from what you'd see in Saskatchewan to maybe what you'd see in Ontario. The first panelist spoke about the longhouse. We don't have that where I come from. So I cannot say what's authentic in their church versus what's authentic in mine. So it really varies from region to region. And I think if the community spoke out and said, you know, this is unauthentic or this is not, you know, culturally appropriated correctly, then that's their voice. And I can speak out on things in my community where if I see something, I could say, well, that's not very accurate. So I think it varies. And I don't think one person can really say what is and what's not authentic.
Fair enough. Yeah. Father.
I think, is that working? Okay. I appreciate the distinction that you're making. I go back to the starting point, the question of the starting point. If the starting point is about seeking to find a medium to convey a truth, then where I would see the distinction between syncretism and enculturation is that enculturation is seeking to say, this is the truth that we want to communicate, and we want to find a way or an avenue where that communication will be best understood or received by the receiver. Whereas my understanding, or what I mean by syncretism, to call it that, is the assertion that whatever you're seeking to convey is true, irrespective of the starting point. And that anything can be used to convey the truth. And that's why I think we have to keep those things separate from each other. That this idea of syncretism has to do with the idea that whatever you want to convey is already true, and whatever means you choose to convey it is also true and valid. Whereas what enculturation as a program or a way of thinking is seeking to convey is that we are saying yes to, or we are serving a truth that exists already outside of ourselves or beyond ourselves. And we are looking for the unique way that it needs to be expressed according to the people who are going to be receiving it.
Maybe just to the second, the question that came about orthodoxy, two things that I would say is the very first missionary activity among the Orthodox came from the west to the east. So the great Alaskan mission from the Russian Orthodox Church, St. Herman of Alaska, and his group of missionaries that came to Alaska and built numerous churches and converted a lot of the indigenous people there to Orthodox Christianity, particularly the Aleuts. And there's St. Peter the Aleut, who's venerated in the Orthodox Church. And even still now, there's a fairly sizable Orthodox population amongst the indigenous people of Alaska. And so that's that first, in many ways, first sort of experience of Orthodoxy in North America. In terms of the sort of the prairies and especially the Ukrainian churches, when the first Ukrainian immigrants came to Canada in the late 19th century, and they were given lands to farm across the prairies, okay, they had experience of that type of landscape, but maybe not that type of winter. And so there was a lot of support provided by First Nations people to those early Ukrainian immigrants to help them survive through the winters. And my own bishop, Bishop Brian Beda of Toronto and Eastern Canada, who's from Saskatchewan, has done a lot of work with Ukrainian people and First Nations people to have a conversation about that experience of a really unique sort of enculturation. And we now have in Winnipeg, there's a mission of the Redemptorists, the Redemptorist priests of the Yorkton province, so Ukrainian Greek Catholic Redemptorists that run a facility there called the Welcome Home that tends to minister predominantly to urban Indigenous people in Winnipeg. And many sort of urban Indigenous people now have an experience of Ukrainian Greek Catholicism in Winnipeg. Bishop Brian also wears for his panagia, his icon of the Mother of God that he wears. It's Our Lady of Guadalupe. And so, and there's more that he could certainly say if he was here about that, about the relationship between Ukrainian Greek Catholics, Ukrainian Orthodox, and the First Nations people, particularly on the plains in, sort of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta. Any other, I don't know, Brian, if you know anything more about that, but yeah. Yeah. But I sense there's some history there still to be written, especially about this interaction between early Ukrainian settlers and First Nations. So, other questions? Yes.
My question is, okay, I think I was at St. Joe's Church, and the priest there did a land acknowledgement and then started the mass.
Mhm.
And I was recently at St. Teresa's, and the lady said, the priest here at St. Teresa's should do like a land acknowledgement and then begin the mass. And I know the liturgy is sacred. Do you think this is possible? That like I'm kind of do you think that that's maybe possible? And if it is happening in some churches,
I think Rosalma has some thoughts on that. I think your eyes sort of perked up. So,
Well, I guess we've been doing land acknowledgements with some of the things that I've been doing here in Ottawa. Well, the Assembly of First Nations, for example, every meeting that they have any part of the country, they do a land acknowledgement of the Salish or the Iroquois or the Algonquin. So, and I know it's been done here in Ottawa too. So it's not unusual. And I think, again, it's that, idea of integrating the culture and acknowledging the Indigenous peoples. So it depends on the church, but yeah. But we've been doing it.
I probably have a unpopular opinion about land acknowledgements, but I have a concern about the frequency with which land acknowledgements are being used now, where I'm afraid that it becomes, I'll give you the example I'm thinking of. In the school district, one of the school districts in the diocese where I come from, at the beginning of every day over the intercom, as part of the morning announcements, there's a land acknowledgement. And at some point, when you hear something so often, you just don't think about it anymore. I think we need to be more creative and strategic in the circumstances and settings in which we would use a land acknowledgement to convey the important message that they should be conveying, as opposed to incorporating them into every occasion we ever have where we're with a group of people, where everyone just sort of rolls their eyes and says, oh yeah, the land acknowledgement, which is kind of it's a bad attitude. But I don't think you can't ignore human nature. And so if people through repetition just begin to become complacent about something or disregard something because of the frequency with which it's used, I feel like we would do better to convey what we want by it if we were strategic about the instances in which we did it, where it would really have an impactful message that, oh yeah, right now at this moment, we're standing on a place that for thousands of years before we got here was sacred to the people who already inhabited it and received it from God. And I think that that's an important way of helping to make that message clearer.
Maria.
So yeah, good question. I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't say something on this topic, being the Indigenous rights lawyer in the room. So land acknowledgements I have mixed feelings about them because of largely because of what Father Christino has very much summarized. They can become very repetitious, and we can kind of roll our eyes about them and kind of have a bad attitude, and they don't have the same meaning or same impact that they were originally intended to have. However, I don't think they're completely misplaced. Just for me, it's more, we come into a space and we acknowledge the land and that we're in. We're in Ottawa right now, so we know that we're on unceded Algonquin territory. And what that means is that there's no treaty. The treaty is in the process of negotiation. So, okay, we know that that's a fact now, but what does that really mean? Right? Like, that's kind of, you just kind of say it in a couple of sentences, and it might provoke people to maybe go do further research, find out, what does unceded mean, right? So it's just not, I just don't think that it provides, in trying to provide context, it doesn't provide enough. That's sort of the issue that I have with them, number one. And secondly, I often wonder if providing those land acknowledgements are consistent with the Indigenous laws that may actually be operating within that territory. Like, how has a particular Indigenous community traditionally or historically welcomed an outsider in? Have they just allowed outsiders to just assert that they're there and that they acknowledge that they're on that land? What laws, what protocols are actually in place to do that process properly? And that's just a question that I have anytime I hear a land acknowledgement.
Melissa, do you have any thoughts on this question?
So I have mixed feelings about this as well. Because I'm from the Treaty 4 area. So if I come to Ottawa and they're doing a land acknowledgement, I feel like, in a sense, I'm not welcome here. Like, this is someone else's land. And I am now sitting in someone else's territory, and it just feels really uncomfortable for me to hear that. And if somebody comes to the Treaty 4 area and we do a land acknowledgement there, they might feel the same way coming in. So you, in a sense, you almost feel like you're an outsider coming into a different community. And that's my issue with it. Now, if it was done in an appropriate form or format, maybe an educational setting, maybe you're part of a land deal that's happening and you do a land acknowledgement, it makes absolute sense to do it in that regard. But if you're just doing it just for the sake of saying it, well, that really doesn't do anything for us as First Nations people, as well as I've also seen it used politically, where people are arguing that someone didn't say it the right way or they didn't acknowledge things the right way, and they're using it as a political advantage to say, well, this party is not, they're not really for Indigenous rights because they didn't say it correctly. So it's used, and from what I've seen, as a pawn for, political parties. And I just don't like that. That's not the whole purpose of doing a land acknowledgement. But if you do it in the correct way, the correct format, where it makes sense to do a land acknowledgement, that makes sense to me, and that would make sense to the people who are in the room with you.
What highlights the importance of being informed and sensitive, and recognizing that there's no one particular way to recognize the role of Indigenous people in Canada. And I think, again, reflecting back on Saint Gadeli's, her witness, now 340 years ago, that she offers to us, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike, a way of understanding place and a way of how you live your life, whether you are a Christian, whether you are not Christian, Indigenous, non-Indigenous. And so I think maybe a nice way to close off this evening is to, again, reflect on her witness, her experience, and what she offers to all of us as Canadians as we reflect on the life of our country, and how we want to build this country in a way that is recognizing the dignity of all human persons that live here across religious lines, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, and what does that mean as we seek to continue that path of reconciliation and healing, and please God, forgiveness. So Melissa, thank you so much for being with us this evening. Yeah, they're a bit nasty that way. Great, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And please thank all of our speakers. And so again, just as we wrap up, and we at Cardus just believe in two fundamental things about events: great hospitality and punctuality. The punctuality means that we kind of conclude things now at roughly 8 o'clock, but the hospitality can continue. It supersedes punctuality. So you're welcome to continue to enjoy some food. If you haven't had a chance to grab a sandwich or a glass of wine or something, please do join us and stay and keep chatting with one another, speak with some of our panelists. And if you haven't picked up your copy of our booklet, I think there's still some over on the tables there. Please take one home and please read it. And if you have any thoughts, you can certainly contact myself here at Cardus via our website, and I'd be happy to pass on any conversations or comments that we have to our interview subjects. Please also join me in thanking again our generous sponsors for this event: the Roman Catholic Diocese of Calgary, the Archdiocese of Ottawa, Cornwall, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and all of our Architect Society donors. Cardus is a charitable organization. We rely on the generosity of people who are committed to this type of work. And so we're very grateful to them and to all of you for being here this evening. Thank you so much. God bless you.